episode of our Naked and Exposed series. We have been going through my new book, Naked and Exposed, Learning to Love Well Using the Intimacy for Life method in your marriage. We have, if you've not caught the earlier episodes, you might want to go back and listen from the start. We've walked through what is intimacy, why, if we are designed to feel connected at a deeper level, especially with our romantic partners, what happens, why is it so elusive? We've talked about those shifting attitudes in relationships and how we move from a place of deep desire to transactional obligation. And today, as we're moving into this next series on this episode, we're going to break it down into a couple of part one, part twos, because it's a little technical today. We're going to have to go into Neuroscience 101. And so as much as I hate to try to talk technically, it's that important that we understand what our brain does in romantic partnering. And when it occurs, why we do some of the things that we do, why we say some of the things that we say, why we act the way that we act. And so a lot of times when I'm working with my couples, when I go into a deeper dive on trying to show and explain the neuroscience, there's almost a relief like, oh, well, that's good to know. At least we know we're not crazy. We're actually pre-wired in our brain mechanisms and that we do this kind of automation. So they get a little bit of a insight and a little bit of relief that we can move it from a place of, embarrassment or shame to a place of curiosity and understanding. So let's dive in today on neuroscience, how brain biology affects your relationships. So we are born with this back brainstem. This is also referred to our reptilian brain. It doesn't have context. It just has those autonomic nervous system responses, meaning it's on all the time and we're not conscious of it. We don't even have to think about it. It has two parts, parasympathetic and sympathetic. One of those parts keeps our heart beating and keeps us breathing, and it's not even in our consciousness, right? And then there's this other part, this survival self-protection measure that's, again, always on, assessing for danger. And when it perceives danger, it moves us into three action tendencies of self-protection. We either fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so through the course of our development, our brain matures all the way up the back, over the top to the front prefrontal cortex. So by the ages of 21 to 26, our prefrontal cortex is fully developed. Now, that's a big span. For female gendered brains, we tend to track more on that earlier side of development, and for male, it's more on the upper end of that continuum. And when we are fully developed, now we have a fully developed abstract reasoning center. This is usually the point in time that we can tease out for ourselves our own moral, ethical, spiritual belief set. Maybe before then we believe what we've been told or taught, but at some point in time we adopt our own. And this is also the part of the brain that really grounds us in the present moment by taking in our sensory input, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Let me give you an example of what I mean about that here and now presence. How many times have we driven home from work and we glide into that driveway and we think to ourselves, wait a second, did I go through that intersection? Was it a red light? Was it a green light? Sometimes our body can be moving through the current moment, but our mind be in a different chronological space of time. So we might be replaying a conversation from earlier in the day, or we might be thinking about that checklist we need to get to when we get through that front door. So the back then and when, or the soon to be. But if we're grounded in right here, right now, that is an activation of that prefrontal cortex. We're taking in sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. I'm like, we can talk more about that because in counseling, we teach people how to turn that front brain on through cognitive reframing skills or mindfulness practices, because when we're grounded in that front brain, we're in our most emotionally regulated place. We are de-stressed, we are relaxed, we feel safe, we feel secure, and we're regulated emotionally. So our emotional brain, I hope you guys are hanging with me here, trying to go through it so that you understand it in the most basic form. Obviously, my book has some diagrams that you can see. It goes into a little bit more detail, but for the sake of our conversation today, we're just going to move through the basics. Our emotional brain takes a very similar trajectory. It develops, however, from the right side of our brain to the left side of our brain as we fully develop over the course of those 21 to 26 years of life. And the thing about our emotional brain is that during a chronological stage of time, we are trying to master an emotional task during those times. So we'll pass through, moving from deregulation to regulation. That's why we get babies on a schedule. Once that's mastered, we can move to the next emotional task, which is moving from mistrust to trust. This is usually the age of separation anxiety. Then we could kind of move from that place developmentally from dependence to independence. So you get it, that we master the task before we can go to the next, all the way up the ladder. So hopefully by those 21 to 26 years, our emotional brain is fully developed, fully cooked with all those higher order emotional intelligent kind of capacities like empathy and stress tolerance and self-esteem. And so how these all interact is we're all trying to give context to this reptilian brain as to whether or not we're making sense of the moment. And if for some reason it assesses danger and it activates, it moves to that back brain activation. So remember, it really can be a physical danger, like that thing that goes off in your body when you move to the side of a cliff. It's that visceral impact that we feel in our body. I say it's the light on our dashboard that goes off to give us a warning signal. For some, they talk about it in their stomach. I feel it in my stomach. I call it my sucker punch. Other people feel it in their chest area, maybe a tightening or a warmth. Other people describe that they kind of feel their heart beginning to race, while others describe maybe a lump forming in their throat, maybe tingling in its extremities. And this is that adrenaline and cortisol that shoots through your body, getting your body ready to fight for protection, run for protection, or get really quiet and still for protection. And so our emotional brain can send off a idea that this is dangerous, and so can our reasoning center send off, oh, this is dangerous, because our bodies respond equally the same to a perceived physical threat, the very same way that we respond to a perceived emotional threat. And so this is what happens in romantic attachment partnerships. When we perceive our partner as maybe not loving, maybe not accepting, maybe not available, or maybe not responsive, then we don't feel safe, we don't feel secure emotionally. And when that threat starts to send off these really quick, I mean, this happens in nanoseconds, that perception of danger, 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 we move to that back brain mechanism of self-protection. And we either ramp up, shut down, or move away from our partners in those moments. And this can become a habituated cycle. Let me give you an example. For instance, if you perceive your partner, maybe it's a tone, maybe it's a word choice, maybe it's a look, maybe it's a certain event or circumstance that in the past has been threatening or not safe. In those moments, danger, we move into self-protection, and usually we habituate to one of those three action tendencies more often than the other two. So if you perceive your partner as unloving and you are a ramper-upper, then you escalate. Maybe you get more demonstrative, or maybe more heightened pressured speech, or maybe coming on with self-protective language, maybe an accusation or a perceived like story I'm telling myself, right? And so then our partner sees that we're coming towards in a heightened emotional way, and they get sucker punched, and they maybe habituate to a shutdown, right? A freeze. And so then they get really quiet. And the stories then begin to kick in. He or she is attacking me, and the other partner, he or she doesn't care, right? And so what happens as we walk couples through understanding this mechanism that happens in their brain and mapping what their action tendencies are, we realize that this back brain cycle, when we're coursing with adrenaline and cortisol, getting flooded emotionally, prevents us to access in those fight cycle moments the front brain. So the front brain, if you remember, is all those calm, cool, collected skill sets, right? So if we're in our back brain, we're not accessing reasoning. We say and do things that are unreasonable. We're not accessing that moral, ethical, spiritual belief set. So we act contrary to the best version of ourselves of who we want to be. And we move out of our grounded present moment, and maybe we're operating on the back then and when evidence, maybe repeated patterns, and that's why the kitchen sink comes all the way back up. Or maybe we're in that fear of the soon to be. We're kind of making up a story of what we perceive is going to happen in the future. We're not accessing empathy for one another. We're not tolerating that stress we feel in our bodies well. And sometimes we just really don't feel really good about ourselves. If the cycle gets really bad, we know it can impact even our regulation. We decompensate all the way down the emotional ladder. Sometimes it really impacts our sleeping and our eating. And so what I need you guys to know is that there is those neurological, biological forces at play that we have to understand. And we have to understand it, because if we can't map it, then we can't build something more regulating in our connect cycle later. And so when we're not accessing our front brain, we're not able in those moments to get to a place of problem solving. We're not able to get to conflict management skills. We're not able to negotiate, compromise, goal set, all of those really great things that are necessary in the moments of conflict, right? And we aren't really able to access greater capacity to hold compassion and understanding for one another. And so this is the cycle. This back brain cycle is the number one predictor of intimacy erosion. It's the number one predictor of relationship dissatisfaction. And how we go about in that back brain cycle can be the number one predictor of divorce. That's why it's so important. That's why we have to understand it. So there's your Neuroscience 101. In our part 2 episode, I'm going to layer in the attachment system. So here's a preview so that you guys can take it all in and be ready for next week. The attachment science is kind of getting more and more notoriety and popularity in the research and in the lay person's understanding. If you've heard of attachment, fantastic. We're going to be talking about the anxious attachment, the avoidant attachment, the fearful or disorganized attachment, and then the secure attachment, because that layered on top of what we just talked about, the neuroscience, does tend to either regulate a couple back to its place of ability to access all those really great things that I just mentioned, or it prevents a couple's ability to ever get to that place of co-regulation in the fight cycle. All right, guys, this is Dr. Shannon. Thank you for joining me, and keep coming back as we walk you through every step of the way of how you too can find your intimacy for life in your marriage with your partner step by step. Go and love well.